All right, any announcements to make? Things that we need to pray for before we get started? Is the sound working? Can you guys hear okay? Okay. Anything special? All right, Ray, you want to start us in prayer, sir? Amen. All right. We started some time ago, and we had a break because I was gone a few times and Jorge taught classes. And so I have outlines through all the first three chapters. We finished chapter 1 last time, and we got into chapter 2, so we're going to try to get through 2 and 3. And if we do 2 a week, we should be done in early August to finish the whole book. Does anybody need a copy of the book as we're reviewing this? I'm not going to put any of the text on the screen. This is all just going to be outlined so we can go faster. I've got extra copies in the office if anybody needs one. All right, so this is the first chapter. I'm going to whirl through this because we've already done this. Everything is interpretation. What do we mean when we say that? Translating from one language to another, not just biblical languages to English, but any language to another language, from German to English or Spanish to German or whatever it might be today, it all requires interpretation. And there's not always an exact one-for-one correspondence between this word in this language and this word in another language. Sometimes there are multiple choices. Reading's interpretation. You are reading a text, something online, a newspaper, magazine article, or whatever, a prescription bottle, and you are reading and trying to understand what's being said along the way. So when we say something is interpretation or everything is interpretation, we're not trying to be negative. We're simply saying it's a natural part of the way we live. Our conversation is interpretation. Sometimes you have to ask people to repeat. What did you say? I heard what I think you said, but what did you say? And then sometimes we'll say, what did you mean? So if we didn't pick up on the meaning, we'll ask. Looking at something, you see an ad, you see a meme, you see, going down, seeing all the billboards along the way. Some of that requires interpretation, and some of them will do something silly or different just to catch your attention. Studying requires interpretation. I'm reading this text. I want to know who the writer is. I want to know why he's writing this. What's this all about? So again, we talked about the whole reading paragraphs and understanding what's going on in the context of our testing when we were younger. So if everything requires interpretation, there's nothing wrong with saying Scripture does. So the temptation to say is to say it means what it says and it says what it means. Well, yes, but sometimes understanding what it says takes a little bit of tweaking and interpretation to get to what the meaning is. So it's not a bad thing to say that, as long as you understand it's not as easy as just saying that. So understanding Scripture does. Understanding requires knowing the forms, the language, the skills, and everything. So we went through this very quickly, so I'm going to go through this very quickly. Exegesis means getting the meaning that's there out. Not reading into it, getting the meaning out. And the difficulty is to make sure we're doing so from the standpoint of who read it first. Who read it first? And so one of the things that comes into play in how we interpret historical documents, government documents, federal documents, the Constitution, Declaration, and so forth of independence, is what did it originally intend? And so there is a framework of meaning that's called originalist. What did it mean when it was written X number of years ago, not what I think it means today? And that comes into play especially as you're reading the scripture. Start with the text and learning to do exegesis, learn the languages, the backgrounds, learn to read carefully. So again, I'm going through this quickly because we've done it before. Learn to ask the right questions. Remember, the answers to questions that we ask may not be the answers to the questions that are presented in the scripture at all. We need to find out what's the issue then so that we can get the right answers. So context is what's the setting and what's the content, what's said around it. That's going to help us understand the context. Again, I'm going to repeat myself so we know that we're going through this quickly. By the way, we can look at this online either at the Facebook page for the church or YouTube. So the historical context, 2,000 years ago, if you were just dropped down 2,000 years ago in the middle of whatever letter that you're reading in the biblical text, Ephesus or Corinth or whatever, you would see people that look like you. They won't be wearing the same clothes, they wouldn't be speaking the same language, but they still look like human beings. So it's not as dramatic. I mean, it is much more dramatic than the original Back to the Future. Remember Back to the Future when that came out? That's like 1985. And so when he was taken back into the 50s, he saw a car pull into a gas station and everybody came out from everywhere and they were wiping down the windshields and all this kind of stuff and they were putting the gas in your car. You know, it used to be in the state of New Jersey, you were not allowed to put gas in your car. It had to have an employee do it. Well, that's the way it used to be. That's only 70 years ago, and the world was totally different. So we need to place ourselves in that time, in that culture, learn everything we can about the geography, topography, the hills, and that sort of thing, so we can relate to how those people were facing whatever then. So a large part of this comes from reading what's there. Literary context is understanding the words that they used then, not words that we use today. What goes on before whatever text we're studying, what's in the text, what's after the text, learning to read not just the words, but the sentences, the paragraphs, the entire letter or the entire book, if necessary. Same sort of thing that we just mentioned. So again, we're just wanting to know what was going on then that will help us understand it now. The lessons then have to come first before the lessons now. So we want to know why the author's writing. Was there a problem? Did he initiate the writing, or was the initiation of the writing caused by somebody outside of himself? Circumstances outside of himself, things that were just going on generally, or did somebody write and ask him a question? And so I get a copy of the magazine called the Magnolia Messenger. If you go online to look at it, you can get it in print free, and there's usually a question and answer thing in every issue. Dan Winkler handles that. And so he's responding to questions that were sent in that he's chosen to reply to. So he didn't just write out of the blue. Somebody asked a question about this topic or that topic. Sometimes the letters, especially the Corinthian letter, we'll get into that, start that way. What are the tools? Start with a translation. Lots of different translations. I saw it as we're reviewing the slides for today. There are 80 different translations of the Bible that have come into being since the turn of the 20th century. That means since 1900. So in the last 126 years, there are 80 complete translations. That's not counting partial translations of some Old Testament text or partial translations of the New Testament. You're going to find more translations in the New Testament than the Old, simply because of our understanding of the application. Well, that's just a lot. Some of them are okay, some of them are not so good, some of them are great. Understanding dictionaries, and when we use the word Bible dictionaries, we mean things that define things as the terms were used in that setting. Bible commentaries, I saw that last week, didn't take off the R. So again, this is all helping us understand how we read and interpret the scriptures. The word hermeneutic simply means to take what we get out of the text and find out how that message then applies to today. There are some passages that have very little relevance to how it applies to us today from the standpoint of practice. You can read the book of Leviticus 100 times in the next week, And most of the things that are spelled out there concerning the sacrificial system applies to you specifically today. Don't read Leviticus as if it tells you what you can and can't eat, because that's not what it was written for. Written at a totally different time, totally different context, totally different people, and it was to emphasize something about holiness in regard for God's commands as it related to His holiness. So part of the be holy as I am holy that's repeated in Peter, that comes from Leviticus, and that's all rooted in their dietary restrictions. Now the significance of that changes when you get into the book of Acts, when Peter is on the housetop to pray, and he sees a vision 3 times about animals that were restricted under the book of Leviticus. And the vision, he hears a voice saying, "Rise and eat," or "Rise and eat," and "Rise and eat." 3 times he said, "No, I'm not going to do that. I'm a faithful Jew." And the text speaking, that in the vision, the text is telling us, he heard the word say, "Don't call what I've called holy, don't call it unholy." So God said this had something to do with holiness then in Leviticus, and it applies in a different way today. And immediately there's a knock at his door, and non-Jews are at his door, spend the night with him, and he goes to teach Cornelius. So the meaning of how all of that book applied then is a very different meaning today from the standpoint of specifics. So we need to understand that. So we start with what's there and lead out of that, find the original text to find out how it applies to us today. So how I understand it today should not be imposed on what they understood then. So the current understanding shouldn't change the original. All right, so we went all that last time. All right, so we went quickly now. We went through it all last time, and we started this. All right, so we're going to go through this in a little more detail. This is all in the 2nd chapter, and if I watch the time, we'll finish the 3rd chapter as well. So the translation. The Bible is originally written in different languages. Modern day Hebrew is not the same as Old Testament Hebrew. And Hebrew and Aramaic is a form of Hebrew, so some of the lettering and stuff is the same, but they're not identical. And then the Greek of the New Testament. And there's some passages in the New Testament that would contain some Aramaic expressions, lama, laba sabachthani. We see that in the text. And then it's translated there. And so we don't speak those every day. So when we are reading in translation. We're reading from whatever translation we have, ESV, RSV, NIV, New King James, whatever it might be. So we're not reading in original. And we need to remember that when we read in translation, we're reading as it's filtered by usually a whole group, a committee of people who are involved in bringing that translation about. And so some translations are one-man translations, and some of them are a few people, but some of them are usually done in large committees, which means you've got a greater chance of everybody's input being heard and not one person dominating how these things are going to be about. And it's not just people voting. It's often based upon what the original text said themselves. That's going to come up later. So one translation can restrict our understanding. I'm going to stop and pause for a second. Due to opinions and biases of the translation. So the New World Translation, that's used by a specific group of people, has some very serious defects from the standpoint of what they think about who Jesus is. The word was a God as opposed to the God. So when we read a translation, we're limited to whatever the translator's viewpoint was at that time or whatever they had available. So let me note this very quickly. And we mentioned it before. So if you go to CSNMT, Center for the Studies of New Testament Manuscripts, I think it's CSNTM, you will see digitized copies of ancient manuscripts in very, very high resolution. There are some 5,500 of them. And all of those contribute to our understanding of how the Bible is best translated today. The reason I bring that up is some of those weren't discovered until recent years. The Dead Sea Scrolls, which teaches us a lot about the Qumran community, those scrolls were only discovered after World War II. So that's, some people here were alive at that time in the late 40s. The point is, some things were discovered later than some translations existed. So the English Revised Version came out in 1881. The American Standard Version, which comes off of that, They agreed not to publish it for 20 years after. That came out in 1901. The King James Version that was initially coming into print in 1611. And incidentally, we have either the fourth, I'll have to double check, the fourth or fifth revision of the King James Version. So when people say, I'll use the original, I'll use the King James Version, what's in print today isn't what the same one was when it first came out in 1611. My point is, when those translations came out, so 1600 AD, that's 426 years ago. There have been discoveries made since then that have impacted how we can better understand the Old and New Testament. So again, the more information you have is going to help you. Benefit of reading from more than one translation might broaden our understanding and meaning. And the whole point of that is, sometimes you will see, when you use that word, what do you mean? And all of a sudden somebody uses a different word, all of a sudden it clicks with you. Oh, I get that word. I didn't see what you meant when you used this word. I get when you mean it now. You didn't change the meaning. You just triggered a meaning that was already there by using a different term that somebody could relate to. All right? So it might eliminate translator issues. All right, before we go further, questions? I'll slow down a little bit. I just want to make sure we get everything done in the second and third chapter. Questions, comments, observations?
What do you think is the best best one to use?
All right, that's going to show up in later slides. There's going to be a chart near the end of this series on chapter 2 that's going to show a range of translations from as literal as possible to as loose as possible, and you'll see the ones in the middle, what they are. And so they're rated from very, very, very strict. So what's the problem with having a literal word-for-word translation? The literal word-for-word translation, you say, well, that's as close to the original as possible. But sometimes the word order and the meaning of those words changes, and when you put it in that way, it doesn't make sense. So when Jesus talks about, somebody that was taken in adultery, the word might be something like the having been put away for adultery woman. You might say, well, that sounds weird, but that's the way it's presented in the text. That word order is followed there, but it means the woman taken in adultery. All right? And so if it's literal, you might say, well, we don't talk like that today. We say the same thing, but our word order is slightly different. And so that's going to be come out in that chart, and we'll pause when we get there. But thank you for bringing that up, Ray. I mean, not Ray, Matt.
Anybody ever check or double check the person doing the translating?
Say that again.
Like double check to make sure they were translating it correctly.
Oh, yeah. And that's one of the advantages of the committees that are involved. So Jack Lewis, who taught at Harding Graduate School of Religion from the 50s until he died in recent years, he was in his 90s, was on a subcommittee of the NIV translation years and years ago. And so they had principal translators, and they would have other groups that would review the work of those who were doing the principal translation as a checks and balances. And let me simply say this. I have a translation, the New King James Version that I've had for years. Evelyn has a copy of an ESV that she uses as her Bible that was given to me years ago. And each of them have gone through translation updates since they've been in print. So if I look at this one, if I'm not mistaken, this is copyrighted 1983. If I go out and buy a brand new King James Version, it's not going to be identical. Why? Because as they review these before they reprint them, somebody will say, hey, we should have used this way rather than that way. And new things may have come to light, and other people said, I didn't see your reasoning before, but now I do. Almost every translation that's out there will go through updates. And some of them you don't even know until I just tell you, or other people tell you, oh, you're reading from the translation that they published and copyrighted in '83, but there's others since then. Same thing with almost every contemporary translation that's out there, all right? And even the King James Version I mentioned before has gone through revisions. They don't call it a new translation. They've updated the existing translation, and so they'll refer to it as a revision. So that's another thing that's important to understand is translations are dynamic and ongoing all the time to make sure, one, that we get as much as we possibly can, the original intent, but also to make sure it makes sense in our culture. I referenced a word study tool by Lou, L-O-U-W, and NIDA, I remember Eugene is the first name for NIDA, but I forget Lou's first name. And they published a book that says, here's how to translate this particular word or this particular expression into different world languages, because sometimes don't translate easily. I used the example before, it's a goofy one, when somebody says, oh, you're pulling my leg. Well, that means you're teasing me, you're joking with me, you're fooling with me, you're just yanking my chain. That's another expression. Well, to use that literally, people say, what do you mean yanking your chain? I don't see a chain. Nobody's pulling on anything. Nobody's pulling on your leg. We understand that's an idiom. So there are idioms of all kinds in all languages. How do you take what's an idiomatic expression in the Old Testament, the New Testament, and bring it into English when we don't even use that expression anymore? So that's one of the things that's going to come up. References to sexuality, especially with reference to gender and with reference to different things that apply at different times of people's lives. Some of the language that's used, we don't use anymore. And if we made it as explicit as it was used in the Old Testament, New Testament, we say, ooh, that makes me uncomfortable that appears in Scripture. And so they will use euphemisms, easier ways to use that term or that thought, simply because it had a darker or a different meaning, something that we're uncomfortable with. So we noticed this before. Most people read translation. We often only read one. I think I may have gone backwards. So let me go forward. All right, so translators make decisions. This is the way the order appears in this language. If I took it literally and brought it into this language, people are going to look at that and say, that doesn't make any sense to me. You've got the words there, but they're in a different order. Or you've used this as a noun rather than a verb, and sometimes that happens. There are some passages in the New Testament that the exact same word appears 3 or 4 times within a few verses, and it's translated slightly differently each time. Well, why? Well, sometimes people do that and say, it looks like it's just being repetitive. But as we've read through 1 John, we see John is intentionally repetitive, and so there's nothing wrong with bringing up the same word. So the other issue is, are we dealing with translations that are based upon text that we can find out whether or not they're credible and reliable? Usually those that are oldest are assumed to be the best, but sometimes you discover an old translation in a later period in time. And how do you know that? Something about the style of writing. So people who do translation from Hebrew or Greek are so familiar with the styles of writing that they can tell without anybody saying, if they look at a few verses from an ancient manuscript, they said, that sounds like Paul. Why'd they say that? Because there's nuances about the way Paul says stuff. You know, if you hear somebody speak, if it's a famous person, you can tell, oh, I know who that person is. That's James Earl Jones, or that's Morgan Freeman, or that's, pick another famous person, or that's another actor, or whatever. Or you hear an expression. That's something that my daddy would say, or that's something my mama would say. And so some of them are so familiar with the way that the original texts were written that they can determine something about the reliability of that text. All right, so we need to understand that there's not an autographed copy of Paul's letter to any church or any individual. Paul would say, I'm writing this with my own hand. Sometimes he would say, a scribe is using that, and it's going to be delivered by somebody. There are no original copies. And so the word copy is the next thing I want to bring up, is everything was written by hand. There were no photocopiers then. Right? 40 plus years ago, I wrote a chapter-by-chapter summary in the course of a year for a congregation I worked with, almost 400 pages, and when we first started doing it, we used it on the mimeograph machine. Anybody remember those old things? It was a mess. They slung that ink all over the place. And so finally the church said, this doesn't look very good. Can we find something better? I said, let's invest in a copying machine. So they did. So they looked cleaner after that. Incidentally, the word mimeo, M-I-M-E-O, if you take off the word O, what do you have? M-I-M-E, or the word mime, which means to copy. So what we understand mimes to be are people who don't speak, but they're doing things in a way that they're mimicking real life action without speaking. Paul uses that word in 1 Corinthians 11. Be imitators of me. The form of it is, form of the word mime or mimeo. All right? So you duplicate in me what you see me duplicating in Christ. So we don't have the original documents. But we have thousands. And again, if you go to the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, you'll see many copies of these, and they will refer to other sites that do that around the world. There's a German site that does the same sort of thing. Thousands of them, all of which are copies. And so what's being done to make sure we have a translation that, or a text that's as original as possible, we look at all of those different copies. So if all of a sudden we had to look at this writing by Paul and I had to examine 5,000 different copies of that over the course of the last 2,000 years, I'd go crazy. I don't have the time to do that, but that's what scholars do, academics do, and sites like what I just mentioned do all the time. So usually the older something is, the more reliable it is. How far back does this go? So this came up in something we were watching the other day. Is an old will necessarily the best will? No. Why? Because it might have been revised. And that's an issue in court cases all the time, not just in detective things online, but the will was updated since then. Well, that has nothing to do with the originality of the New Testament manuscripts, except that what we want to do is find out what's the one that's in effect now. Has this one been signed? Has this one been notarized? Has this one had an attorney or some legal professional look at this to make sure that this is the one that's intact now, that this is the one that applies? So all of this comes into play. Studying ancient texts takes time. And, we will look at it later. If you look at copies of the ancient texts, some of them, they don't make any sense whatsoever because the script is totally different. And again, they're written in a different language. Sometimes they're written in all capital letters. Sometimes they're written with no breaks between the words. And sometimes they have almost no punctuation whatsoever. Well, if I did that, you might think Jody's an idiot. He's writing all these words in capital letters. There's no breaks between them, and there's lines upon lines upon lines. But if you knew the language then, that's the way you would be able to read them. That's just the way they did it, all right? And that's not even talking about other languages. Hebrew is written in such a way that you read it in the opposite direction. Rather than reading from here to here, you would start here and read it that way. And if you looked at a Hebrew text, you wouldn't open it this way. You would see this on the back, and you would open this way, and you'd start turning the pages this way. So they're not only reading it from right to left, they're reading it from what we call back to front. It's just a different style. And so becoming familiar with all those things just takes a little bit of time. All right, so you compare all of these texts together, the quality and so forth. Let me just note this very frequently because I used a lot of shorthand things to keep everything on one line. MT stands for Masoretic text, which is usually a term that's used to refer to the best documented Old Testament text. DSS is shorthand for Dead Sea Scrolls. LXX, if you look at it as a number, simply means 70, all right? But it's used to refer to the Septuagint, and so you hear septuagenarian in part of that, 70, because it's assumed that during the time of Alexander the Great, when the Old Testament was translated into Greek, that there were roughly 70 scholars involved. So it's often referred to as the Septuagint. And let me simply say this as something to make us think. Much of the New Testament, even the words of Jesus, follows the word order of the Greek translation of the Hebrew rather than the Hebrew itself. Why? Because that was what the popular translation was of the day. It's not saying those people couldn't read Hebrew. It's just that over time, from the time the Old Testament text was done, in the hundreds of years between the time that this was translated into that, 300 years later, people are using the Greek translation more than they're using the Hebrew. So what's the big deal? Nothing really. My point is going from one translation to another doesn't necessarily damage the original intent. All right? So I've used the illustration before, and it's corny. 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. There's no difference in the meaning. No difference in the meaning. All right? That's my father's father. Well, could you say grandfather? Well, no difference. So we understand that. So in some passages, it talks about, and there's an example in a different book that I'm reading about a related thing. One of the authors that's involved in this wrote this book. It talks about the passage that says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. Some of the passages in the New Testament only use 3 of those. And some of the passages that refer to the same context in which Jesus is speaking will use some of them, but in different order. But the point is, you still get the gist of what's being said. Nothing changed from the meaning, all right? If Ray and I are at the same event and we witness the same thing, my guess is that Ray's going to tell something that he saw that I might not have seen, or he's going to say something that both of us say, but he's going to present it in a different way. All right? So if there's an accident at the intersection right out there, and 4 people are in different corners and see it, they're all going to see it from a different vantage point. They're all talking about the same thing, but they didn't all bring out the same information. So one of the criticisms that some people have of any ancient text, especially biblical texts, is this, well, why do we have Matthew, Mark, and Luke? Some of them talk about the same stuff, but they don't present it the same way. There's value to that because there's checks and balances in the variation that they presented. All right, so we compare all these ancient texts. All right, before we go further, anything else anybody wants to bring up? We're going to get to the translation model that I mentioned before.
I've said this before, but we have to remember that language evolves.
That's correct.
And that's going to affect translations of the Bible.
That's correct.
As well as any other language, any other group,
Right.
any other study.
And we need to become familiar, if you're into British, television and a lot of the things that were written by Jane Austen that are contemporary performances, one of the things that's unique is some people have taken that and as literally as they possibly can, had somebody do exactly what's written the way she has written it, and they act it out. There's multiple versions of that over years. But some people have taken the themes and have modernized them and updated them by using contemporary language in contemporary settings rather than reproducing the period costumes and the language that was then. What did they do? They translated the essence of what she was writing about into a contemporary setting. How well did they do it? Well, that depends on what version you're talking about. And so that's a translation of an existing work, hopefully being faithful to what was presented. All right, let's go a little further. So textual criticism is talking about how do you know that this is what was originally there. I'm not going to go into that because that's a lot of study that is going to be explained in more detail in the book itself. I encourage you to read that. So these are just quick notes. So many human variables. Why do you want to use this word as opposed to that word? Well, it's a matter of preference that I have because of whatever the reason is. Does it change the doctrine? No, it doesn't change the doctrine. All right? So the words that are translated as teaching and doctrine often come from the same term. Somebody asked the question, what's the difference between teaching and doctrine? Nothing. They both come from the same word, to teach, didaskalo. And so in most texts, there's not any difference between them. The word that's translated 10 times in 10 verses in 2 Corinthians chapter 1 is sometimes translated as consolation and sometimes translated as comfort. What's the difference? No difference. Same word. They just translated in different ways. All right, so we don't want to change anything from the text itself. Don't rely on one piece of evidence. Look at multiple ones, and usually when you do so, you'll see how they fit. All right, choices. What are the words that you're going to use when you translate it, and how are you going to arrange it grammatically in the new language? So you're going to see 2 shorthand things. OL, which means original language, so I did that to save space, and RL, which means receiving or receptor language. So how do you go from the OL, the original language, and bring it into the receiving language and keep the intent of the language you started with? That takes a skill set. How do you look at the words and bring them into this new language if it hasn't been done before or hasn't been done correctly? Do you make the word a verb? And so verbal doesn't mean literally a verb, it's a part of speech, but as you bring it into a word. Some verbs are translated as nouns. Some nouns are translated as verbs. Some adjectives are translated as adverbs. Why do they do that? It fits better sometimes. And occasionally there's a word added here and there. So in the lesson I presented last week at the congregation at Woodstock, I made reference to a passage in Mark when it says the second is like unto it in Mark chapter 12. But in Mark chapter 12, the word like doesn't appear. but it appears in parallel translation and parallel passages in the exact same context from the words of Jesus in red letter, if you're using a letter, and the word homeos is there. Homogenized means it's all brought to be of the same consistency. So the letters H-O-M-O in a prefix in the Greek language mean the same as. So it's translated as like. The second commandment is like, and the word there is homeos. All right? So it appears in sometimes out of the mouth of Jesus, depending which gospel you're reading, and sometimes it doesn't. The point is when you look at all of them together, you see consistency. And even without that word being there, you get that idea. This one follows naturally from that one and is just as important because you can't keep the first one except you keep the second one. And so even though the word like doesn't appear in every original text, the intention is there. And so sometimes you'll see a translation and you'll see a word in italics. And sometimes the word in italics means it's been supplied. Why is it supplied? Because the way it's originally written, it was assumed to be there without stating it. All right? So when we use a word, sometimes you use one word and there are three words built into that word in the original language. You have a first person plural verb, and it means I am saying, but there's only one word there. Well, how do you get three words out of one word? Because it's built into the original language. And so that's how you have to learn to work from translation from one language into another, understand that this has built into this kind of word more than we see in the way we use it in ours. It's just difference in language, all right? Make sense? All right, if it doesn't, you have to let me know. So, issue, and we've just said this, transferring words and ideas from one language to another so that you can understand it. So the original language, that's the one you start with, and the receptor language, that's the one you're translating to. So I use the letters OL and RL after that. All right, so here's the thing that I mentioned before, and I'll make this bigger if we need to. All right, so questions. Free translation means that I don't care about doing it from a one word to another word that's identical. I just want to write it so it's close enough for me to get a meaning. All right, but that ignores the original language itself. So here at the bottom, and I know this is not as big as you can. Here are formal equivalents, which means it's trying to be as literal as possible. And here are translations that are like that. King James, New King James, New American Standard, HCSB is the Holman Christian Standard Bible, RSV, Revised Standard Version, the updated that, the ESV, which is popular today, the NIV. So as you come this direction, they become looser in translation. That doesn't necessarily mean they're bad until you get way over here. The Living Bible is pretty much a paraphrase. The Message by Eugene Peterson, who's a Greek scholar, by the way, is very loose from the standpoint of the way it's presented. So those that are in the middle here are the better ones to use from the standpoint of reliability. But even better than that is not just using one. Not just using one. So you will see, even when it's over here, it's interesting, it doesn't even have the American Standard Version here that came out in 1901. One, because it's not as popular as it was 100 years ago. But even among those that are more literal than others, you still see differences in translation. Why is that? Simply because they were translated at different times by different groups of people. All right? The word Easter appears in the King James Version, but doesn't appear in any other translation. Why? Well, there was a little bit of influence on the translators to keep it there because it was a recognized practice at the time the King James Version came into play. But the word that's translated as Easter in the context of the book of Acts, the word Pascha refers to the Passover. Why did they translate it as Easter there? Because that's something that they were already celebrating as a different kind of holiday than what the original Passover was. So it's remained even to this day. All right? But in later translations, you don't see it. So my point is, different translations at different times had different flavors to them, in part because of history. And incidentally, the King James Version that most people are familiar with because of the Elizabethan style and the way it's worded and these and the thous and that sort of thing, that has a history going back multiple years, long before it ever became finalized or codified from translations that preceded it that it was built on. This didn't come out of nowhere. That has a history. That has a history. So, and what I mean by that is it's a revision of other translations before that did a lot of work before you even get to that translation. So it's a revision of prior translations that most people don't even know anything about. So the work of William Tyndale, for example, who was killed for bringing the Bible into English, was involved as a predecessor in translation. So I don't want to overstate anything, but very few translations just came out of nowhere. They all start in part based upon something that somebody else has done. Let's start here and see if we can make it better. This one specifically, the New King James Version, is pretty much starting in part, there are textual things that are different from the standpoint of manuscript evidence that was now available here than was available there. But they're pretty much nothing more, and I want to be careful about saying that, just updating the old style language in a more contemporary language. That's an oversimplification. So, answering Ray's question before, these are they're trying to keep word for word order. Sometimes in the course of doing literal word for word translation, you lose something about meaning because it doesn't translate well into the receiving language. Well, how do you know? You just look at the different versions of that and see how it's worded. All right? So, the last one that says paraphrastic means to paraphrasing. Tell me in your own words what this means. I do that all the time, rather than reading, 15 verses and say, here's the essence of this passage. Don't take my word for it. Look to see whether or not I've represented it fairly. And sometimes we do that on a regular basis to introduce a passage. So the difference is, how formal is this versus how functional is it? If it's formal, it might be stilted. Notice the language, it might be stilted. So how do you take away what comes across as stilted language, archaic language that we don't use anymore, and make it so we can understand it now? That's why you have a range of translations that some of them are much more functional. That relates to me today. All right. So if you read in the book, each of those is detailed in much more detail. All right. Each of those are addressed, and so some of the translations that are here, the authors will discuss the pluses and minuses of each of them. All right. And that's way beyond what we need to do for this session. All right. Does that help, Ray? All right. So if you look at the text in the second chapter, it's going to address a lot more of that. Problem areas, and this is near the end of that, so we'll have some time to get in the next one. Weights, measures, and money. So does anybody know the difference between, how many pounds are in a kilogram? Anybody know? Anybody know what a kilogram is? 2.2 pounds. Anybody know what a kilogram means? 1,000 grams. All right, so the whole point is that's the different way. Anybody know the conversion between metric and non-metric, SAE?
I'm doing Rangers, but that's all.
That's about it. Okay, so some of them are close enough that you can get a metric wrench to do a SAE or the other, but they're not the same. All right, what's the difference between a yard and a meter? Which one's longer? Meter. A yard is 36 inches and a meter is 39.34. So if somebody says, I can run 100 faster than you, are you talking about yards or meters? Because a meter is going to be a little bit longer. 100 times the extra 3.4, so you've got some extra inches. You've got another 300 inches there. Oh, wait a minute, you got me running another 20 plus feet. The point is, some of those things don't easily translate, and so sometimes we approximate. So a day's wages is often used the word denarius in the Old Testament, in the New Testament. And a talent is used in varying sums of huge amounts of money. Sometimes it's what it would take people to earn over the course of 20 years. So sometimes those don't translate very well. Euphemisms, that is, expressions in which you use a nicer word to represent something that's not so nice. And that's especially used with reference to very sarcastic references, either in the Old Testament or New Testament, that usually have sexual overtones. All right? And not in a way that's blasphemous or being nasty. It's just using an expression that's common to depict something spiritually from the standpoint of how people in the world might use that. All right? And that's not saying the Bible's full of that. It's just some of that's there. All right? vocabulary. And the whole point is there's no perfect translation in which that word automatically is perfect in this language, and that's the only way it can be. Or that word order is perfect in this language. You just don't have that anywhere practically. There's always a way that it can be presented in a different language, maybe a little clearer than the way it's going to come across in our language. Word plays. And so word plays, you know, when they make a play on words, alliteration is used throughout the Bible. There are passages, the book of Psalms, the 119th chapter. What's so unique about the 119th chapter?
It's the longest chapter in Psalms.
All right, the longest one, and is in 22 stanzas of 8 verses each. Why 22 stanzas? Because there's 22 Hebrew letters. And each one of those stanzas, each one of those 8 lines in each stanza starts with that letter. So the first ones all start with the Hebrew letter Aleph. The next one start with Beit. Next one Gimel. Next Dalet. They all start with that letter. And so you've got 8 verses in a row that start with A, so to speak, and then B, and then C, only the Hebrew. And that's how you get the number of verses, 176. That's a unique thing. But it was done in order to make it memorable, all right? The book of Proverbs are often used in such a way that's unique. The same thing is stated 2 ways in the same verse, sometimes 3. And sometimes it'll say the same word in a similar way, or sometimes it'll say the same expression antithetically to teach the opposite to make a point. And sometimes it'll have one, then the other, and then a summary. All right? So those are just unique things that are going on that you don't see all the time. The different sounds, sometimes the language. So how could people distinguish between those who are true Jews and those who were not true Jews? Pronunciation. They couldn't say the word shibboleth. All right? There are some people who are from different countries of the world who, because of their original language that they grew up speaking, have a difficult time pronouncing something in a new language. And you can tell, you're not from here. Yeah, I never learned how to say that word. And there are some groups of people, depending on where they're from, you can just tell they haven't learned how to say that because they lived a lifetime before they learned a new language, and they never pronounce it the exact same way. And guess what? We do the same thing when we try to speak their language. You know, there's a sound that's there, all right? So there's a sound in German. And when I was in 10th grade, a friend of mine, Doug Brethauer, his dad was a chaplain at the base where my dad was. He could never pronounce it the right way. Rather than ich, I-C-H, which is the first person plural I, he would always say ich, like I-C-K. And the teacher would always get after him and say, no, it's got a different sound to it, all right? And so those are all unique to that language. And you just have to learn how to do that. It has a sound to it. The R's in Spanish are sometimes rolled, all right? So, Evelyn, speak up and give me an example.
Jorge's here. Excuse me.
Jorge. Oh, thank you. Jorge. Guess how many times your name's come up recently, Jorge? So there's a gentleman that I met when I was out walking the dog. We were walking by each other, and he's from Puerto Rico. He's from Isabela, Puerto Rico. And so he told him when we lived in Rio Piedras. He goes, "You lived in Rio Piedras?" I said, "What's your name?" He said, "Jorge." I said, "I know another Jorge." So the other day he called me. He said, "Hey, I'm at the grocery store. I've got meat. Let me come to your house and eat." I said, "You've got to give me notice. You can't do that." But he'd ordered so many groceries he couldn't get home, so I went to Kroger and picked him up. So I knew Jorge Rosado. Right? So there's a role to that, all right? And some of that, it comes out, that's not critical in understanding a text, but we just need to know it's there. Evelyn, you were going to say something else.
Can we go back to something about the literal versus the meaning?
Yeah.
Thought translation. So I remember this when you were talking. I remember this from way back when the Living Bible was popular, and you have it up there. You have it on as one of the.
Yeah, that probably goes back to the 70s.
Yeah. So I mean, it was kind of a big deal back then.
Oh, yeah.
People really liked it. So 1 Peter 3:21 says baptism. I'm reading out of the ESV.
Right.
Which is it translates this very literally.
Yeah.
Baptism, which corresponds response to this now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And that makes clear that when we are baptized, we are asking to be cleansed,
Right,
okay, which corresponds to the fact that it says it saves you.
right,
Not the water, but the obedience and faith and God's grace.
right.
So the way they translated that,
In the Living
the
Bible.
Bible, that, by the way, is what baptism pictures for us. In baptism, we show that we have been saved from death and doom by the resurrection of
So
Christ.
there's a theological interpretation of that translation.
So they shot down the meaning and
Yes.
added some other stuff.
Right,
On the other hand, there are reasons sometimes to translate something a little differently.
right,
And I just did a quick search because I remembered this thing about something about Jesus saying, I
stand at the door and
at the
knock.
and knock.
Yeah.
And in some cultures, that would refer to.
That's the way a thief comes to your house.
A thief will
Yes.
come right up to your house.
Yes.
Or you don't knock because there's a culture in Peru where there's basically not a door.
Yes.
And there's someplace in Africa where there's usually like a mat or it's just a hook. So then people have translated it in such ways as, I stand in the yard and call.
Yes.
Or I stand in the yard and clap.
Yes.
Because that's what you do there. And to make Jesus not look like a creep or a thief.
Right.
That's how they had
Yeah.
translated it. So that's
In other words,
legitimate.
the word baptism is not translated. It's transliterated.
And that's
We took a word, I say we, over years we took a word that some people didn't want to say what it means by definition, but they just turned it from a Greek term into an English word by changing the way it appears. So it comes from the word baptismos. So how do you try? That's not a definition. All you did was change it from one form to another, but you didn't define it. And that's one of the problems that you have. And that's not just the only word that does that. There are many others. All right, let's see if we can wrap this up on science translation. So this is what we're talking about before, the different rules. So there are many, the word genitive means possession. That is the car of mine. You might say, well, that's not the way we speak, but that's the way some languages write. And sometimes it's my car. So sometimes when God speaks about grace, it's the grace of mine. And God says, it's my grace. So you might say, well, they mean the same thing, but we don't speak that way. That's not the way we present. It's shorter by a word, by putting my in front as a possessive, showing that it has ownership. And so the same thing. So this is interesting. In the word order in the book of Genesis, every verse from the standpoint of everything that God created all starts with the same word. And 26 consecutive times. And some translators said, that's too much. We're going to cut out some of the ands. But they were there intentionally. They were there intentionally. In the passage that we will get to, probably not now, the translation of Paul's use of the word, it'll hit me in a second, wisdom, 26 times in 3 chapters in 1 Corinthians. It appears 18 times over all of the rest of his books. Well, why is he using that word so many times in 1 Corinthians chapters 1, 2, and 3? Because many times he uses it sarcastically to refer to what they call wisdom that's not wisdom at all. What you call wisdom, which isn't wisdom, is something that I'm calling you out on. Your wisdom has become something totally different than what God says is wisdom. In their wisdom, it was an issue of pride, throwing their arms, back, their shoulders back, and puffing out their chest and saying, "Look how wise we are." But everything it says about God's wisdom indicates humility, not braggadocio. And so he calls them about their false use of wisdom by constantly using the same term repeatedly in 3 chapters. And you couldn't read that in the original without missing it. You can't read it in English without missing that. He talks about so-called wisdom. So when somebody says something is so-called, you might think, wait a minute, you think it's not really what it says it is? What do you mean so-called wisdom? Well, you're calling it wisdom, and Paul's saying, I'm calling you out. It's not wisdom at all. So that's unique. Gender matters. So sometimes the use of man, generic men, brothers, it refers to all humanity. That's just a common thing that you see. Plural singular, male or singular, refers to all humanity. All right, I think we're at the end here. Difficulties, I mentioned this before, more than 80 New Testament translations since 1900. Some are good, some are outdated. I thought it was total, but this one says New Testament. I'll double check that. Some are biased. The New World Translation, we already mentioned that already. Some of them are eccentric, some that you've never heard of. So things to remember. Wise to use versions for comparison. Not that one's better necessarily, it could be, or lesser, but sometimes it just helps you to see something you never saw before. I mentioned this before in reading Spanish translations of text. I see a word that's translated in Spanish in a way I say, now that's a different slant, a different idea that I haven't seen before. All right, so I'm going to introduce this. We only have 5 minutes left. This is starting contextually. This is section number 3. So all this is done. But thinking contextually means let's look at some examples of a passage or two passages. He deals with 1 Corinthians and Philippians. 1 Corinthians in great detail, Philippians in shorter detail, about how you understand what's going on in a text that's going to help you understand what the problem is. I've already mentioned part of that. The use of the term wisdom is used sarcastically to point out that you think you're wise, but you're not really wise, not according to what God says. So letters, and here's part of the problem. I've got letters from my aunt, my uncle, my mom's, my dad's, whatever. Those are the easiest things to interpret. But there's a whole lot of assumption there. First, when I read my dad's letters, I have an interpretation problem immediately because he had horrible handwriting. All right? That's no criticism of my dad. It's just his handwriting wasn't very easy to read. My mom would tell me, don't write anything to me, type it, because she couldn't read my handwriting. And so over the years, Evelyn teases me about it. If you pick up anything that I write in, all the journals I have at home, it's all capital letters, everything. Why do I do that? So I can read it. And so that's just a different thing. So when we read about the ease of the letters, assuming that it's just a letter, it's just a letter, all right? How many temples were in Corinth at the time that Paul was writing it? What was the size of Corinth relatively compared to every other city in the Roman Empire? How long it had been in existence? What were some of the unique things that were going on there? Why was it such a cosmopolitan city? What do we mean when we say cosmopolitan?
Trade.
Everybody and their grandmother lived there from all over the world. All right, and if you look at where Corinth was, you'd see it is a major, major, major trade center. And there were 26 temples to 26 different deities in the context of that city at the time that it existed. It was a relatively new city. It only existed about 90 to 100 years before the church was there. So understanding something about all that helps you understand why the problems that are addressed in 1 Corinthians were such a big deal. Most of them had to deal with moral issues. Why? It's Corinth. That was just like what they talked about, all right? So do we ever use the expression Sin City referring to specific places in this country? Yeah. Does that mean everybody there is guilty of whatever we think about when we use that expression? No. It's just that it's got a history. It's got a persona. It's got a culture that's there. That's what's going on with reference to Corinth. Oh, that was real good. All right. We're at the top of the hour. I wanted to go faster than I did. I know I always go fast anyway. But we will deal, there's only 6 or 7, 8 slides it looks like in the section on that. Let me scroll down. A few more than that, maybe 10. But we'll look at that next time, and I'll try to be a little bit faster. Anything, try to be shorter than what I say and cover more material. All right? So when we're done, you'll have the outline from these slides of the entire book. All right? And just a reminder, read the chapters, and hopefully when you read them after having listened to this and seeing the slides when you have them all in your possession, it'll make more sense to you because you're seeing what I'm talking about when you actually read the text. All right? And if you haven't gotten the text yet, I've got the leftover copies that are sitting in a box in there. All right. Anything else that we need to address before we go? Oh, I'm sorry. Got to put your hand up higher.
In reference to what Matt asked about, is anybody checking like the translators?
Yeah.
This may not be directly answering what you said, but, in the Old Testament and the New Testament, we have to remember, there were ancient languages, and the languages have changed and work. But that's not Bible, and written in Greek that's not Bible. So that's how scholars determine, like, how are these words used? Because you can look at sources that are from the same time period and see, like, what did this mean? And then as far as individual translators, I mean, sometimes it's a matter of, like, in the Living Bible, just comparing it with translations or word for word, with maybe a little bit of thought translations in those areas where there has to be. And you can see somebody just inserted their own, their own ideas.
All right, so I'm hovering over one word, and there's a little thing right by it, and I will make this bigger so you can see it. So this particular word appears in the text in verse 40, and what it does, it has all these shorthand ways of referring to something that's going on. You might say, that makes no sense whatsoever to me. But they're in critical versions of the New Testament in Greek to tell you what manuscripts support that translation. And if there's an exception, it will say so. And so there are some translations that adopted a use of expression, and it appears only out of 5,400 translations, 5,400 manuscripts, it'll only appear in one or two of them. Well, why would you use that? Well, it doesn't change the meaning, and it makes us feel better. All right? So, okay, that's not inherently wrong, but there's not a lot of manuscript evidence for that. So at the bottom, each one of these, so I'm going to go back to the regular size. I'm going to close this. So when I go back to where this came from, I don't want to close the whole thing. I want to leave that open. Let me close this. Let me get back to it without messing anything up here. All right, so let me try this again. I closed one thing and I didn't close it the way I wanted to. You're driving me crazy. All right, let me see if I can go back to what I want to do here. Let me open this. What I want to do is show you that the Greek text, okay, let me do this. Here we go. All right, there we go. You're giving me grief. Let's see if it's doing it. The wheels are spinning, and this usually means, there we go. So when I look at this, every one of these that I hover over, so that's a different word, and I'm not going to make it big so I don't mess up. But down here, all of these different things are shorthands for different Greek manuscripts, where you can find proof that that was in a translation that has history going back hundreds and hundreds of years. All right? So they don't just put something there and say, why is it there? We liked it. No, you've got to say, is there manuscript evidence for it? Can you find a copy of this particular? Sometimes they don't even have that detail because it's everywhere. But if there's a unique occurrence of a term that's somewhere, they're going to say, where am I going to find it in what manuscripts where? Because let me simply say this, the manuscript evidence for the New Testament isn't, when I say 5,400 manuscripts, they're not 5,400 totally intact translations of the entire New Testament. They are pieces of the New Testament. So you might have so many pages of this document and so many pages of that document, some copies that are complete of some of the shorter epistles like 1st or 2nd John or 3rd John. There are only 13, 14 verses in our translations. And so this doesn't come into play. So my point is, there's a science behind gathering the evidence and comparing them that never stops. It's been going on since it was first written, and it's continuing even today by means of studying all of those things that we talked about. All right, so my point in response in part to what Evelyn just brought up, reminding me of what Matt brought up before, there's constant checking and double checking. Constant double checking, all right? So it's in principle the same thing. Somebody says, well, I know you told me this, doctor, can I talk to somebody else? I want a second opinion, and maybe you want more than that. And so you will see in exegetical commentaries, somebody says, this particular passage has been generally understood this way or that way, and here's where we think this comes from, and why, and who's taken this particular time. So they're always documenting things. It's going to be a rare day that you're going to find somebody says, well, this just came out of the blue and we like it. You know, that's just not the way it's done. All right, the whole point is to build credibility in the text. All right, anything we've overlooked? Nathan said before that his brother-in-law is doing better, and so we're thankful for that. I did mention it before, but a good friend of mine, Gary Hampton, his wife, who has multiple sclerosis, MS, fell the other day and is in rehab again. If you would keep her in prayers. Her name is Teresa. And anything else that's going on locally we need to keep mind of? A week from yesterday is the next elders preachers meetings, and I think that's going to be at Shannon. So if you wanted to go to that. All right, Matt, you want to close us out with a